My husband drove to the credit union every Thursday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. For 31 years of marriage, through blizzards and heat waves, through the year his back gave out and he could barely sit in the car, he never once missed it. When I asked him why, he'd squeeze my hand and say the same thing every time. Just making sure we're taken care of, love. Just keeping things in order. I believed him. Of course I did. Clifford was a civil engineer. He'd spent his whole career building bridges and overpasses across northern Ontario, structures designed to hold weight, designed to last. Order wasn't just something he valued, it was the language he thought in. Our mortgage had always been paid on the first of the month. Our RRSPs were maxed every year before the deadline, our property taxes filed without a single late notice in 3 decades. When friends complained about money stress, I used to feel a quiet, private gratitude that I'd married someone who had it all under control. I trusted him the way you trust a load-bearing wall. You don't think about it, you just live inside the house. The morning he died, I was at the community garden 2 streets over, pulling up the last of the season's beets. It was a Tuesday in October. Cold enough for gloves. The sky, that flat pewter gray that settles over Sudbury every fall like it's decided not to leave. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket and I almost didn't answer it because my hands were muddy and I thought it was probably just my sister calling about Thanksgiving. It was our son Andrew. Mom, his voice was wrong, so carefully empty of everything that I dropped the beat and stood up straight before he said another word. Dad collapsed at the office. They couldn't bring him back. Clifford was 66 years old and had never had a sick day in his life, or so he told me. His heart had apparently disagreed for some time without bothering to inform either of us. People say grief moves in waves. Mine didn't. Mine felt more like standing in a kitchen after a power outage, reaching for switches that do nothing, everything familiar and completely useless at the same time. I moved through the funeral arrangements in a fog that somehow felt efficient. I thanked the right people. I chose the right flowers. I accepted every casserole that arrived at the door and stacked them in the freezer in careful rows, which is something Clifford would have appreciated. 4 days after we buried him, a letter came from Meridian Credit Union. Plain envelope, our address printed on the front, the kind of thing you'd normally toss on the pile to open later. Something made me open it at the mailbox standing on the front walk in my coat. It was a form letter expressing condolences, informing me that as the co-holder on file for a personal safety deposit box I was entitled to access following the primary holder's passing, I was invited to call the branch to arrange an appointment. I read it twice in the cold. We had a safety deposit box, 31 years of marriage, and I had not known this. I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and held the letter for a long time without moving. Then I called Andrew. He drove over that evening, still in his work clothes, and I showed it to him across the same table where we'd eaten 10,000 dinners. He read it and looked up at me and I could see him searching for an explanation, the way a person looks for something they've already decided must be there. Mom, maybe it's just old documents, insurance papers maybe. Dad was always so organized, maybe he just never mentioned it. Maybe, I said. But I knew, somewhere I couldn't quite name yet, that it wasn't old insurance papers. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in our bedroom, in the bed that still smelled like him, and I thought about 31 Thursdays a year multiplied by 31 years. I thought about the way he always left before I was fully awake, the sound of the garage door at 8:45, the coffee already made and waiting for me. Thoughtful, I'd always thought. Considerate. Now the thoughtfulness had a different shape, and I couldn't stop turning it over in my hands. The credit union branch was on Elm Street, a 12-minute drive from our house. I knew the building. I had driven past it 1,000 times. I had just never gone inside. The branch manager, a soft-spoken man named Colin who looked young enough to be my nephew, met me at the door with the practiced warmth of someone who has delivered difficult things to difficult situations before. He walked me down a short corridor to the vault room, a space I had never been in, smelling of metal and recycled air and something that reminded me of old paperwork in the way that all official spaces do. Box 214. 2 keys. A small private room with a table and a chair. He told me to take all the time I needed and close the door behind him. The box was heavier than a box that size had any right to be. I set it on the table and stood there for a moment looking at it. Metal. Gray. Unremarkable. I had the strange thought that Clifford would have chosen the plainest one available. I opened it. Inside were folders, 4 of them, each labeled in Clifford's handwriting, his precise engineering print, that I had spent 31 years reading on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter. I opened the first one. Investment accounts I had never heard of. Not our joint accounts, not the RSPs we reviewed together every February. These were accounts in Clifford's name alone, opened at 3 different institutions, and the statements inside told a story of losses so consistent and so large that I had to sit down and read each page twice because my brain kept refusing to accept the numbers. Commodities funds, a private equity stake in a mining operation near Timmins that had gone bankrupt 6 years ago, a margin account with a brokerage I'd never heard of, the balance a single digit. The total losses across 8 years of statements sat at just under $320,000. I turned to the second folder. My hands were not shaking. I noticed this the way you notice strange things in strange moments, the flatness of your own body, the way it just keeps going. Home equity line of credit. Clifford had drawn on it twice, both times without my signature, which meant something had been forged. The total outstanding balance was $212,000, secured against our home, the house we had bought together when Andrew was 3 years old. The house where I had repainted the front door 4 times and planted the lilac tree by the fence that was finally starting to look the way I'd always imagined it would. I set that folder down and picked up the third one. I saw my name on the first page and thought for one strange moment that it must be a mistake. Credit applications, a Scotiabank Visa, a Capital One card, a line of credit through a company I didn't recognize. All of them in my name. All of them with my social insurance number. All of them with a signature that was not mine but was close enough that I understood immediately why no one had flagged it. The total balance across all accounts was $87,000. He had used my identity. My husband had borrowed $87,000 in my name, and I had never known, never received a single statement, never been asked a single question. I sat very still for a long time. The fourth folder was thinner. Inside was a single envelope, cream-colored, with my name on the front in Clifford's handwriting. Just Sylvia. The way he used to write it on birthday cards. I opened it. Sylvia, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found the box, and I'm sorry it doesn't come close to covering what I owe you. I know that. 7 years ago, I made a decision I was certain about, an investment through a contact at work, a resource fund that everyone said was a sure thing. It wasn't. I lost our savings, and I panicked, and I made another decision to cover the first one, and it went wrong too. And by the time I understood what I'd done, the hole was so deep, I couldn't see the top of it. Every Thursday, I went to the branch trying to restructure, trying to buy enough time to fix it before you ever had to see it. I thought I could get us back to zero. I truly believe that. I was wrong. By now, the house is probably at risk. Your credit has my mess attached to it. I'm sorry for the Thursday mornings. I'm sorry for telling you not to worry about the finances. I'm sorry for all the years I said I had it covered and let you believe me because it was easier than telling you the truth. I loved you every day of our marriage. That part was real. Clifford. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope back in the folder and the folder back in the box, and I closed the lid. Then I walked out of the private room and down the short corridor, and I said to Colin, who was waiting at his desk with the look of a person who was pretending not to be watching, I'm going to need complete copies of everything in that box, and I'm going to need the name of a lawyer who handles financial fraud. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, I know someone. I'll write down her number. Andrew was parked in our driveway when I got home. He'd taken the afternoon off work, and I hadn't asked him to. And I was grateful in a way I couldn't have articulated then. He met me at the door and looked at my face and didn't ask me anything, just followed me into the kitchen and sat down. I spread the copies across a table the way you'd lay out evidence, which is what they were. He read everything, all of it. His face went through several things in the span of about 20 minutes. The careful blankness of someone trying to hold themselves together. The flush of something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and finally a kind of raw, gutted stillness. When he finished, he looked up at me. Mom, his voice was quiet. The house, your retirement. I know. Everything he built. Everything we built, I said. And yes. He pressed his hands flat on the table. We'll figure it out. We have to figure it out. I looked at my son, 40 years old, his father's jaw and his father's way of going quiet when he's calculating something, and I thought, yes, we will, because we don't have another option, and because Clifford left us the truth at least, even if he left it in a safety deposit box in the credit union on Elm Street instead of handing it to us when there was still time to do something together. The lawyer's name was Fatima. Colin from the credit union had described her as thorough, which turned out to be the understatement of the year. We met in her office the following week, a bright second-floor space above a pharmacy on Paris Street, with plants on the windowsill and a whiteboard still covered in someone else's case notes. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she put down her pen. I want to be very direct with you, she said. What your husband did constitutes financial abuse. The forged signatures on the line of credit, the fraudulent use of your social insurance number for credit applications, those are criminal acts. The fact that he's gone doesn't change what they are. The word sat in the room. A breeze. I had spent 2 weeks assembling a version of events that explained everything as a desperate mistake, a good man making bad choices, the drowning person Clifford had described himself as, but a drowning person doesn't forge their wife's signature on a credit application. A drowning person panics. What Clifford had done was deliberate, systematic, and careful. It had happened over years. Both things were true. I knew that. I was still figuring out how to hold them at the same time. Fatima laid out what was possible. We could file fraud reports with each of the creditors, supported by a handwriting analysis of the forged signatures. We could challenge the home equity draws on the grounds of forgery. The HELOC was the most complex piece because the lender would argue that as his spouse, I had benefited from the funds, even though they'd gone into investment accounts I'd never seen. That fight would likely require court. How long? I asked. 8 months, possibly a year, and there will be costs. I thought about the number Clifford had left in our joint checking account, $48 and some change. I thought about the $320,000 in losses and the $87,000 in my name and the $212,000 against our house. Then I thought about Fatima's whiteboard and her plants on the windowsill and the fact that she was looking at me like I was a problem she intended to solve. Tell me what to do first, I said. Our daughter Renee called that night from Vancouver. She and Clifford had always been close in the particular way of a father and a daughter who share the same stubborn certainty about things. She listened to what I told her and then went very quiet. Mom, are you absolutely sure about the accounts in your name? I have the statements in front of me, Renee, but Dad wouldn't. He loved you. He would never have done something that would hurt you on purpose. He did it to buy time, I said. He told us that himself. She said she needed a few days. I said I understood. Andrew called me an hour later to say that Renee had phoned him in tears, insisting I was making some kind of error, that grief was distorting my interpretation of the documents. She'll come around, Andrew said. She just needs time to get there. I wasn't sure time was the only thing she needed. I had watched people choose a comfortable story over an uncomfortable truth before, and I knew there was nothing to be done about it except wait and not push. The next 2 months moved in a particular rhythm. Fatima's office, the credit bureau, the fraud dispute process, evenings at the kitchen table with Andrew and his wife going through documents. A handwriting analyst confirmed that the signatures on the credit applications were not mine. 2 of the smaller creditors accepted the fraud reports within 6 weeks and removed the balances from my credit file. The HELOC lender did not accept anything and indicated they intended to proceed with the lien on the property. I found a part-time job in December, 3 months after Clifford died. A used bookshop on Cedar Street run by a woman named Bev, who was 68 and had bought the shop from its original owner a decade ago because, as she told me, she had reached an age where she only wanted to spend her days around things she loved. She hired me 2 afternoons a week, plus Saturdays without asking many questions. I told her the basic outline anyway, because I was tired of editing myself, and she listened and then said, "Good. You need somewhere to put your energy that isn't the paperwork." She was right. The court date for the HELOC dispute was set for late February, 4 months after Clifford's death. In the weeks before it, I found myself sleeping badly, lying awake cataloging the Thursday mornings I remembered, cross-referencing them with what I now knew. There was a particular trip I remembered from 5 years ago when Clifford had come home from one of his Thursday mornings looking gray around the eyes and told me he'd had a headache all day. I had given him an aspirin and made soup and worried about his blood pressure. Now I understood what kind of morning it had actually been. Andrew came with me to the courthouse. Renee didn't. The night before, she sent a text. "I can't watch them go through Dad's records in a courtroom. I hope you understand." I replied that I did. "I hope you understand too," I added. She didn't respond to that. The hearing was in a small courtroom on Larch Street, not the dramatic setting I had built in my imagination. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Justice Beaumont, who gave the impression of someone who had heard most of what the world had to offer and remained unimpressed but attentive. The bank's lawyer was a man who spoke in the careful, polished cadence of someone very used to being agreed with. Fatima was better. She walked through the evidence the way Clifford had built bridges, piece by piece, each one load-bearing, the forged signatures confirmed by expert testimony. The investment account statements showing exactly where the funds had gone, none of them accessible to me, none of them bearing my name. Clifford's own letter, his own handwriting, his own admission. Then she called me to the stand. "Mrs. Kate Whitfield, when did you first learn these funds had been drawn against your home?" "When I opened the safety deposit box, 3 weeks after my husband's death." "In 31 years of marriage, did your husband discuss taking out a home equity line of credit with you?" "No." "Did you receive any of the funds from these draws?" "No." "Did you sign the original application?" "I did not." The bank's lawyer stood up. He had the confident posture of a man whose arguments have rarely been questioned. "Mrs. Whitfield, you trusted your husband entirely with the family finances." "Yes." "So you made a choice to be uninvolved." "I trusted him," I said. "Those are not the same thing. You lived in the house secured by these funds for 31 years. I lived in my home, yes. The one my husband and I purchased together. The one he mortgaged without my knowledge. You never suspected anything was wrong?" I looked at him carefully. My husband was a structural engineer. His professional life was built on precision and reliability. He applied both to concealing what he'd done. Was I naive? Perhaps. Naivete isn't consent. It isn't complicity. And it is not a reasonable basis for holding me liable for fraud committed against me. Justice Beaumont called a recess. We waited in the hall. Andrew paced. Fatima checked her notes. I sat on a bench and thought about Renee, about the particular stubbornness she'd inherited, about whether the truth would reach her the same way it had reached me, not gently, but all at once, undeniable and requiring a decision. After 40 minutes, we were called back. Justice Beaumont looked at both tables and then at me. "I've reviewed the evidence in its entirety," she said. "The expert testimony regarding the forged signatures, the documented pattern of concealment, and the respondent's own written admission establish clearly that these draws were obtained through fraud without the knowledge or consent of the co-owner of the property. I cannot hold Mrs. Whitfield liable for debt created through the fraudulent use of her identity. The liens on the property are released." Andrew took my hand. Fatima allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel after a very long drive in difficult conditions, glad to have arrived, but aware of how much the road took out of you. That evening, Renee called. I answered on the second ring. "Mom." Her voice was different, smaller. "I'm here. After the hearing today, I called the credit bureau. I just wanted to look at Dad's credit file. I thought if I could see it myself." She stopped. "There's a card in my name, Mom. A retail card from 3 years ago. The balance is gone, but it was opened in my name. I never opened it. I never knew it was there." I closed my eyes. "Renee, he used my SIN number, my information. Mom, I was so sure you were wrong and You weren't ready to believe it," I said. "That's not the same as being wrong for feeling it." She came home the following weekend. Andrew and his wife came too, and the 4 of us sat at the kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and did what families do when the thing they've been avoiding finally arrives. We talked about it, all of it. The investments, the debt, the forged names, the Thursday mornings, the letters, the man who had taught Andrew to skate and walked Renee down the aisle and brought me wildflowers from the side of the road every summer because he knew I liked them. The same man who had, over the course of 8 years, quietly dismantled the financial life we built together while telling me not to worry. Both people were real, I said. I had to say it more than once before it started to feel like something we could all hold. Fatima helped Renee file her own fraud dispute. The retail card was removed from her file within 2 months. Andrew, who had never told me this before, mentioned one evening that 3 years ago Clifford had asked him to put money into the same resource fund, $50,000 he'd been saving since before his kids were born. Andrew had almost said yes. His wife had pushed back quietly and firmly until they'd agreed not to. When he told me, I thought about all the places the damage could have spread and didn't, and I was grateful for his wife's stubbornness in a way that had no adequate words. Bev, at the bookshop, turned out to be a good person to know during a difficult year. She had a way of listening that didn't require her to fix anything, which was rarer than it should have been. One slow Thursday afternoon, Thursdays still caught me sometimes, a small involuntary flinch, she told me about her own marriage, which had ended 20 years ago after she found out her husband had been running a second household 2 towns over. Not a financial story. A different kind of secret. The same fundamental architecture. The people who told me to forgive and move on, she said, straightening a stack of novels, were always people who'd never had anything taken from them that they couldn't replace. I've come to think that the people who push hardest for forgiveness are sometimes just uncomfortable with how long grief takes. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I was 63 years old and had not worked full-time since Renee was born. My RSP, which I thought was healthy, had turned out to be emptier than Clifford had ever let on. The withdrawals taken in small enough amounts over enough years to stay below what I had any reason to scrutinize. I started looking at retraining options, at bridge benefits, at what I was actually entitled to from the Canada Pension Plan and OAS at 65. I made a spreadsheet. It was the first spreadsheet I had made in 30 years, and the experience of understanding my own numbers, the actual numbers, was disorienting and then clarifying, and then something that felt almost like relief. Bev eventually offered me more hours. I took them. The bookshop became the shape around which the rest of my days organized themselves, and there was something useful about that, about needing to be somewhere that wasn't my own head. Then, one Saturday in March, a woman came in and stood in the self-help aisle for a long time without picking anything up. She was maybe 50, well-dressed, the carefully composed expression of someone managing a great deal just below the surface. I asked if I could help her find something. She looked at me and said, I don't even know what I'm looking for. I just know something is wrong. We talked for over an hour. She told me her husband managed everything, the investment accounts, the mortgage, the tax filings. He told her she wasn't good with numbers, that it was easier if she just let him handle it, that she didn't need to understand the details because he had it all organized. But recently she'd found a statement in the printer tray by accident, and the numbers didn't match anything she'd been told, and when she asked him about it, he'd laughed and told her she was misreading it. Trust what you're seeing, I said. Ask for full access to every account, not a summary, not his version. The actual statements. What if he gets angry? I looked at her. Then you'll know something important that you didn't know before. She came back 2 weeks later. She'd gone to their financial institution herself and requested a full account summary. There were 2 accounts she hadn't known existed. Her name wasn't on either of them. She'd hired a lawyer the day before she came to see me. I don't know what I would have done without you, she said. You would have figured it out, I told her. You were already figuring it out. You just needed someone to not tell you you were wrong. A few months after that, Bev and I started a monthly evening in the back of the shop, folding chairs, a kettle, a few boxes of tea. Word got around in the way word gets around in a city like Sudbury, which is smaller than it looks and more connected than people expect. Women came. Some of them had financial stories. Some had different ones. All of them had the particular experience of having been told in some form or another that what they were seeing wasn't what they were seeing. I shared my own story at the first meeting, all of it, the safety deposit box. The Thursday mornings I'd spent 31 years not questioning. The forged signatures. The courtroom. Renee. The $48 in the checking account. The letter Clifford had left. The inadequate apology that was also, somehow, the only true thing left. Someone asked how I'd stayed calm through all of it. I hadn't, I said. I'd cried in the parking lot of the credit union before I drove home. I'd sat in the bathtub at midnight reading credit statements until the water went cold. I'd been furious at Clifford in a way that had no outlet because he wasn't there to be furious at, which is a particular kind of awful that I don't recommend. But I'd kept moving. Not because I'm strong in any particular way, because the paperwork wasn't going to file itself, and the lawyer needed documents, and the alternative was to stop. And I had looked at what stopping would cost me and decided I couldn't afford it. The group grew over the following months, 15 women, then 22. We shared the number for a local credit counselor who worked pro bono for people in financial crisis. We passed around the name of a paralegal who helped people navigate fraud disputes without the full cost of a lawyer. We talked about what financial abuse actually looked like, which was rarely dramatic and usually just quiet. One person managing everything, the other person slowly forgetting they ever had access. On what would have been our 32nd anniversary, I went to a different branch of a different bank, one Clifford had never set foot in. I opened a checking account and a savings account, both in my name only. I had my own online banking login, my own debit card, my own access to my own numbers. The young woman at the desk was friendly and efficient and asked if I had any questions. Just one, I said. How do I set up automatic alerts so I can see every transaction as it happens? She showed me. It took about 4 minutes. I thought about 31 years of not knowing. Then I went and changed my name on the account. Not Thompson, not Whitfield. Sullivan Marsh. My name before I married, the name I'd been given, the one on my university degree that was still in a box in the spare room. I hadn't gone back to it because I was erasing anything. I'd kept enough of the past to know it was real. I just wanted the parts of myself I'd set down along the way, the pieces that had slowly stopped feeling necessary, and I wanted to pick them back up now that I had the hands free to do it. I walked out of that bank into a bright April afternoon, the kind of cold but clear day that arrives in northern Ontario and makes you remember why you live there, the sky sharp and clean and very large. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about the woman in the community garden who had answered a phone call and dropped a beat in the mud and would not have recognized the person standing here now as herself. I recognized her. It just took a while. If any of this sounds familiar, the locked filing cabinet, the conversations that get redirected, the feeling of something just slightly off that you can't name because everything looks fine on the surface, please trust that feeling. Ask for the statements. Ask for all of them. Don't let anyone, including someone you love, including someone who has given you every reason to trust them, tell you that you don't need to know. You need to know. Because love built on financial secrecy isn't protection. It's control. It doesn't look like control. It looks like care. It looks like someone who has it all handled, someone you don't need to bother with the boring details, someone who is, as mine was, just keeping things in order. If you find yourself standing in a small room in a credit union, looking at a metal box that explains 31 years in ways you weren't prepared for, I want you to know this. You are not the mistake that was made. You will feel like you should have known. You will catalog every small thing you missed, every question you didn't ask, every Thursday morning you accepted without wondering. That's normal. It is also eventually something you can set down. You are still standing. And that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Start there. Look at the documents. Ask the questions. Find the Fatimas and the Bevs and the Saturday mornings in the back of a bookshop full of folding chairs and cold tea and women who are tired of being told what they're seeing isn't real. And then rebuild. Slowly, imperfectly, in your own name. I did, and I am still here. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that October morning when Andrew called me and my whole life reorganized itself without asking permission. Not in an abstract way, in the specific, practical way of someone sitting at a kitchen table with a stack of copied documents and a lawyer's phone number and 31 years of trust that turned out to have a different shape than I'd understood. Here's what I've come to believe: Clifford wasn't a monster. He was a person who made a choice and then made another choice to cover the first one and kept making that same choice for 8 years because stopping would have meant telling the truth, and the truth had become something he couldn't face. That's not a defense of what he did. What he did was wrong, legally, ethically, in every way that matters. But it is an explanation, and I think explanations are worth having. not so we can excuse things, so we can understand how ordinary people arrive at extraordinary harm, one small decision at a time. What I didn't understand for a long time was my own part in it. Not the fraud, that was his. But the conditions I'd lived inside for 3 decades, where I had handed someone else complete authority over our shared financial life and called it trust. I thought trust meant not needing to know. It took everything falling apart to teach me that real trust doesn't require blindness. It's built on transparency, on both people being able to see. When Renee called after the hearing, when she told me about the card opened in her name without her knowledge, I heard something in her voice that I recognized from my own first hours in that small room at the credit union. The specific grief of discovering that love and harm can come from the same source, that the person who taught you to feel safe can also be the person who quietly removed the floor. It doesn't make the love false. It makes reality more complicated than most of us are ever prepared for. What I am proudest of, and I say this not as a boast but as a reminder to myself, because I still need reminding, is that I kept moving when stopping felt like the more honest response to the size of what had happened. Andrew was there. Fatima was methodical and clear-eyed. Bev gave me somewhere to put my hands and my hours. The women who came to those Saturday evenings in the back of the bookshop gave me the particular sustenance of being believed. None of that was luck. It was the result of asking for help, which is its own kind of intelligence, the understanding that rebuilding alone is slower and harder and less necessary than we're often taught to believe. I think about the young woman who came into the bookshop with the instinct that something was wrong before she had any evidence. She was already doing the brave thing. She was listening to herself. That's where it starts. Every time. Not with a lawyer or a credit bureau or a courtroom, but with the moment you decide that what you're seeing is real and that you're entitled to know more. I'm 64 now. I work in a bookshop. I have a bank account in my maiden name and online alerts set for every transaction. I know exactly what's in it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole point.